when you go there today, all of the locals still believe. They point to the mountain. They say, this is the mountain of Moses. They say, this is the split rock of Moses. They say, these are the caves of Jethro. This is the well of Moses. So the whole area is littered with legends and stories of Jethro and Moses. The locals all believe this is the real Mount Sinai. They never stopped believing it. They don't believe it because they, saw some YouTube videos of Ron Wyatt. And so this is just important not to take away credit from anybody in modern times, but to simply point out the fact that it was never lost. The locals have always believed this, which adds a tremendous amount of credibility to the idea that this is, in fact, the real Mount Sinai.
It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Joel Richardson, and we're going to be discussing his new book, Mount Sinai in Arabia, The True Location Revealed. Joel, welcome back to the show.
Shaun, good to be back with you. Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, let's start out with the backstory of people who have gone before on this Mount Sinai in Arabia kind of topic. I mean, you mentioned a bunch of these different people in the book. Would love to have you just comment on, whether it's Jim and Penny Caldwell, Ron Wyatt, Bob Cornuke, Larry Williams. Who are some of the men and women that have gone before and paved the way with some early adventures and early research? You're standing on some shoulders with the work you're pulling together here.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So in 1983, 84, Ron Wyatt, he was, I think, a nurse, an esthetician, just sort of a self-funded, explorer, researcher, went with, I think, a couple of his sons. I don't know if it was on the first trip or the second trip. He was convinced that this was the real location. He actually, I believe, snuck into Saudi Arabia, ended up getting arrested. But he was the first one that really sort of started publicizing this. A few years later, as you mentioned, Bob and Larry, not to be confused with Bob and Larry of VeggieTales fame, Bob Cornuke and Larry Williams went, and they also sort of, we'll say, hit the evangelical circuit talking about this. There was a book written about their adventures. And then during the 90s, you had Jim and Penny Caldwell. They're this super sweet couple. He was working there for Aramco on the East Coast, and they went up there many times actually with their two young children and really thoroughly explored the mountain. I mean, far more than anyone previously. Took all kinds of videos and pictures. And then later they actually shared all of their pictures and videos with both Ron and Bob. And so they were sort of then traveling around, popularizing this again, sort of in our corner of the Christian world. And then, and I'll just sort of throw this out, there was sort of in the early days, a lot of almost, I'll say, conflict between the different camps. You had some folks that were big fans of Ron Wyatt, others of Bob Cornuke and this sort of thing. And so it's been interesting for me all these years later to go, and there's been several others that have gone as well. My good friend Ryan Morrow recently just released about a half-hour video that he put on YouTube about the mountain. But it's been interesting as I've jumped in to try to navigate some of these strange sort of conflicts between these different camps. And I'll just throw this out. What's interesting is Ron Wyatt, he's someone who absolutely deserves credit. In modern times, he was the first guy that has brought attention back to this. But I get a lot of these comments. I'll put up a video and they'll say, well, Ron Wyatt discovered it. Ron Wyatt deserves all credit. And I go, well, look, I believe in giving credit where credit is due, honor where honor is due. But here's an important point. The mountain was never lost. And the reason I say this is because when you go there today, all of the locals still believe. They point to the mountain. They say, this is the mountain of Moses. They say, this is the split rock of Moses. They say, these are the caves of Jethro. This is the well of Moses. So the whole area is littered with legends and stories of Jethro and Moses. The locals all believe this is the real Mount Sinai. They never stopped believing it. They don't believe it because they, saw some YouTube videos of Ron Wyatt. And so this is just important not to take away credit from anybody in modern times, but to simply point out the fact that it was never lost. The locals have always believed this, which adds a tremendous amount of credibility to the idea that this is, in fact, the real Mount Sinai.
Well, and one of the things I found really interesting that you talk about in the book is the state of security around the site is very different. Having read other people's accounts of visiting the site, it's fenced off, there's security, and it sounds like things are very different, at least at this time or last time you visited.
As I mentioned, when I was there, yes, there was fencing. And let me say this as well. I went with a few friends who had visited several years previous, again, who worked for some of the oil companies over there on the East Coast. They had gone up and explored it. One of them, when they went up, got arrested. So we were going into it knowing that there was a history of some sketchy security. The local Bedouins have essentially been deputized to keep people out, to keep Western explorers, or trespassers out. And there were fences put up, but in sections, the fences have been knocked over. And in more recent years, the security has become quite lax. So as we went in, it was sort of a hit or miss. We didn't know, and this is the reports that we got back. One day, the locals could be very friendly. The next day, you could run into somebody very hostile. About a week before I went, Ryan Morrow was there. Not a week before, but shortly, a few weeks before I was there. And some of the locals actually were chasing them and shooting at them. So this is sort of what we were going into. We weren't really sure what we were going to encounter, but our experience around the mountain was that everybody was very friendly and we didn't run into any hostiles at all.
Let's take a slight left turn for a moment and talk about what is traditionally known as the traditional Mount Sinai site. St. Catherines Monastery is there. What are some of the problems with that site? Just having read a range of books on this topic, there's a lot of things that are missing for that to actually be considered a legitimate Mount Sinai site.
Yeah, well, first of all, the very notion that this is the real Mount Sinai is not an idea. You don't find it in history until the 4th century. In the 300s, you had all of these Egyptian monks that then started sort of fleeing what they felt at the time was corrupt modern society, in Egypt, Alexandria, and so forth. And they fled, with Anthony and all these monastics out into the desert. And they just developed a tradition that this was the Mount Sinai. I really think it was just sort of, I don't even know if they believed it or if they just said, well, maybe this is it. But it was a tradition sort of that then began to be developed at that point. We can't find anything earlier than that. So then you had these various pilgrims that would come from Europe and the monks would meet them and say, this is the real Mount Sinai. By the 5th century, after a whole bunch of the monks had, over the years been killed by some of the various Saracens or the Ishmaelites that lived down there in the Sinai Peninsula, after they were getting killed by these local children of Ishmael, if you will, then you had Emperor Justinian built what is today St. Catherines Monastery. Now, it's a fascinating historical site. I mean, it is essentially a fortress. We call it a monastery. It's a fortress with walls that are 50 feet tall. I mean, it's massive. And this was to protect the monks. There's also a basilica that's there inside the walls. It's a little mini village, if you will, within the walls. And so here's the point is, once the emperor established this is the real Mount Sinai, because the full name of St. Catherines is St. Catherines Monastery of the Holy God-Trodden Mountain. Okay, so once the Roman Empire, if you will, established that this was it, well, then you have the full weight of, we'll call it compounding tradition that developed. And so since then, this has sort of become the traditional site. But the problem is there's really no solid historical, archaeological, geographic, or biblical evidence that this is the real mountain. It's just this tradition that springs up in the 4th century. We can see how that tradition then grew and developed and calcified. But there's nothing earlier than that. And there's huge problems, with, for instance, they have a rock. They say, well, this is the split rock of Moses. And you've just got this little spring that sort of bubbles up out of it. It doesn't match the criteria of the biblical description of the split rock. And you could go down the list of things like this. It just simply does not align with the biblical criteria.
Next, let's transition into kind of history and tradition that support the Mount Sinai site actually being in Saudi Arabia or Arabia, a range of support there.
First of all, we have to begin with this very ancient tradition. So you go back to 3rd century BC. So now you're talking 600 years prior to this other traditional tradition. So with the translation of the Septuagint, this is the Greek translation of the Old Testament that started about 250 years before Jesus. Okay, so there are pretty clear hints within the Septuagint in terms of how these Jewish, although Hellenized, they were influenced by Greek worldview and culture, how they understood the land of Midian in particular. And so the land of Midian, according to the Septuagint, was not treated like a land, rather it was treated like a city. And so there's various hints within the Septuagint. When they refer to the elders of Midian, for instance, they use a word in the Greek, which is the city counselors. It talks about Jethro going out of Midian, which is the language of going out of his city and this sort of thing. And then also, it's interesting, there is a variation within the text. Whenever they refer to Midian in the Hebrew, whether in the Dead Sea Scrolls or in the Masoretic text, there's a variation and they say Madiam or Madian. The reason that's important is because in the late first century AD, you have this geographer, this Roman geographer named Claudius Ptolemy, and he actually locates on the eastern shores of the Red Sea, again over there in northwest Saudi Arabia. He has two towns. One is called Modiama, the other one is called Madiana. So it's clear that by, this is 1,500 years after Moses was there in the land of Midian. It's clear that there had been a little bit of a variation in terms of where Midian was and this sort of thing. But you can see that the translators of the Septuagint believed that Midian was over there in northwest Saudi Arabia. Okay, so why is that important? Well, again, because then you have Philo and Josephus, who both say that Mount Sinai is the tallest mountain just outside the district of Midian. Okay, so we begin with this very ancient tradition. Well, then in the Christian era, you have some of these early Christian writers. You have Demetrius, you have Eusebius, you have Jerome, and a handful of others. And they all pick up on and continue to propagate this ancient Jewish tradition. Well, so then in the 7th century, when Muhammad comes along, the early Muslim geographers refer to all of these Christian anchorites or these monastics living in the mountain there just outside of, today the city is called al-Bad, but again, this would have been the ancient city of Midian. So this is an unbroken tradition. And again, this is the reason the Muslims believe it today. It goes back to this very ancient Jewish belief that goes back to the 3rd century BC, that this was the mountain. So you begin there with this tradition, and then you begin to weigh all of the biblical, the geographic, the archaeological evidence, and the cumulative argument for this mountain known as Jebel al-lawz over in Saudi Arabia. It's really, really very convincing.
Let's have you comment on the physical features as far as the layout around the mountain, some of the carvings, artifacts. There's a wide range of things. What are kind of those top, say, 4 or 5 features that say Jebel al-lawz is really the site?
And it's interesting, the way I say it is I go, look, if this is not the real mountain, then the Lord has in his sovereignty allowed an incredibly specific, detailed series of coincidences that look strikingly similar to exactly what you would expect to find if this was the real Mount Sinai. It's really hard to deny. You have to believe in a lot of coincidences to discard this. So first of all, just the topography of the mountain. According to the scriptures, if you really track through the account in Exodus and Numbers, they would have been on the eastern side of the mountain. So when you're on the eastern side of the mountain, again, the tallest mountain just outside of the ancient city of Midian, which, by the way, in terms of the topography, this ancient city of Midian, which is today al-Bad, it's an oasis. When you understand the area here, this is a complete desert. This is right along the ancient Arab caravan route that would have gone up from southern Arabia up to Egypt or Syria. So this is the most natural place where anyone would have settled in the area, this very lush oasis. Okay, so just outside of that is this incredibly tall mountain range, Jebel al-lawz. That lines up with, again, the sort of criteria of this ancient tradition. Well, on the eastern side of the mountain is a river, exactly like Deuteronomy explains, coming down the mountain. When we were there, it was a dry riverbed, of course, with mountains. These are going to run in the winter and then probably dry up a bit in the summer. And at the very base of this river, exactly where you would expect to find it, is indeed an altar that specifically conforms to the description of what you would expect to find if it was for the purpose of slaughtering animals. It is right at the base of the mountain. You're talking, 15, 20 feet from the dry riverbed. The Saudi archaeological authorities did a survey on this site about 10, 15 years ago, and what did they describe? They described finding animal remains, ashes, bones, animal waste, and this sort of thing, bones. So this is what you would expect to find if this was a place of sacrifice. Right next to it, what do the scriptures describe? The Lord told Moses to set up 12 pillars after the tribes of Israel and set it up next to the altar. To this day, you still have these pillars that are sitting there. And by the way, the locals say that back in the 40s, these pillars formed a larger sort of monument. And they say it was built by Solomon the Great. This is according to the local tradition. And they say in the 1940s, somehow it got disassembled. So I don't know the full story with that. Interestingly enough, the altar, by the way, is made of uncut stones. That's exactly what the scriptures describe. Then you have a couple football fields, we'll say a few hundred yards from there. You have this massive pile of rocks, very large rocks, of which have carvings, petroglyphs of cows, of bulls and calves all over in sort of a large mural, several of them all over this very large altar that you could very easily see would have been a place where they could have set up the golden calf idol. It's all right there in terms of as you're standing there, you can look and say, if that's the golden calf altar, then this makes complete sense. If that is the altar of Moses, it makes complete sense in terms of the layout. The big one, of course, is on the western side of the mountain, which is exactly where we would expect to find a very large landmark that we believe is the split rock of Moses. And you go, well, Joel, there's a lot of rocks in this area. I've seen pictures. Why would you say this is the split rock of Moses? Well, because the scriptures say, the Lord said to Moses, I want you to go strike the rock at Horeb. So this was a well-known, identifiable landmark. And of course, this rock that we're talking about, it's roughly 50 feet tall. It might be a little bit more, it might be 55. I'm guesstimating now, looking at some pictures, that it's 50 feet tall. So you're talking 5 stories tall, this massive rock, which is just balanced on top of this other pile of rocks, a sort of small hill about 100 feet tall. And it is clearly split right down the middle. I mean, it is a striking, unusual landmark. The scriptures say in Isaiah 48, very end of the chapter, that the Lord split the rock. He clave the rock. He baka, just like he split the sea. He split the rock right down the middle. Now, again, to contrast that with the traditional site, we just have this rock with a little sort of bubbling spring. It's like the Beverly Hillbillies, out came some bubbling crude. This is not what is described in the scriptures. It says the rivers gushed forth from the base of this. And when you stand there at the base of the rock, it clearly shows what appears to be massive water erosion bursting forth out of this rock, which sits in one of the driest places in the world. It has everything else that you would expect to find: massive plains just right next to the rock. This is where the Israelites would have fought in a massive battle against the Amalekites. Very tall hills just next to this rock where Moses would have climbed up and held his hands up all night long. And so, on and on it goes. All of the scriptural criteria is there. And it's one thing to hear somebody talk about it, because I'm a very skeptical individual. I was very cautious going into this. But as you're there, as you look around, you go, yeah, everything lines up. And, like I said, if this is not the real site, then I think the Lord has specifically punked all of us. It's a very clear setup. And there's going to be many other sites, spots and drawings and carvings that will be discovered. When I got there, as soon as I got there, I'm walking across this eastern valley. Right at the base of the mountain were these paintings of archers, a big mural of these paintings of archers. Well, I was the first one to ever photograph these. I conferred with Jim and Penny and, everybody. We're all sort of talking behind the scenes, exchanging texts and so forth. No one's seen these. Well, what does it say in Exodus 19? The Lord told Moses to set up markers around the base of the mountain and warn everyone, man or animal, not to step foot on the mountain. And if they did, they were to be either stoned to death or shot through with arrows. And so here you have, I'm just wandering along. I don't know what I'm doing. Here's this mural of all of these archers painted on these sort of tall rock outcroppings. And I'm sure that years ago, there were many more before they were washed away. So I expect that over the next few years, there's going to be many, many more finds. I've actually talked with some of the Saudis, and they say they're going to bring out many artifacts that they have found and that they've been storing away for many years. So I'm excited. I think we're going to see a lot of exciting things in the years ahead.
Well, and one of the nice features of your book is you do have a good number of color photographs. So anything you want to comment on as far as some of the things that you do feature images of in the book?
Some of the things I just mentioned. There's also right there in the center of Al-Bad. Now, again, this just sort of adds to what I've previously said. There's an archaeological site. It's sort of a park. The Saudis, again, have fenced it off, and you can go. And visit. And they call it in Arabic, it's Mughir Shu'aib, which means the caves of Jethro. The Quran calls Jethro Shu'aib. And so they believe that this is Jethro's house. This is where Jethro lived, which means this is where Moses lived. It's right in the center of town. It's right in the center of Al-Bad. This would have been the center of ancient Midian, this ancient oasis town. Just right close to it is something they call Moses' well. It's a very ancient well. Many of the ancient Muslim geographers refer to it as a well that was used up till just several hundred years ago. So when Moses met his wife-to-be Zipporah, which was Jethro's daughter, he met her at a well. We have the biblical account. And so again, there's just an example of how all these things line up. And so I've got a whole bunch of pictures there of Jethro's house, Jethro's caves in the book. And interestingly, when you step out of Jethro's house, the first thing that you're greeted by is this massive silhouette, the contours of the mountain itself as that greets you of Jabal al-lawz, which, by the way, in Arabic means the mountain of almonds, which in itself is interesting because there in the biblical account, Aaron had what? An almond rod, and it was placed into the Ark of the Covenant. And the menorah, of which the Lord gave Moses the instructions to design there on Mount Sinai, is modeled after almond branches, and on it goes. So even today, this is called the Mountain of Almonds. You could go down the list. There's many other things, but it's, as I said, if these are all coincidences, there's an awful lot of them.
Next, I'd love for you to comment on Paul's visit to Mount Sinai. That's something I've not heard a lot of people talk about, so that was new to me.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. So in Paul's epistle to the Galatians, you've got one reference in chapter 1, another one in chapter 4. In one of the discussions, Paul says, look, he goes, after I had my experience on the road to Damascus, after I had my conversion, he goes, I didn't consult. Now, again, we have to understand the context here. This was Paul, who was extremely zealous. He says, extremely zealous for the traditions of his fathers, i.e. for Torah, for the law. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees, blameless in all these things. Suddenly, he gets knocked off his horse. Yeshua appears to him and says, why are you persecuting me? His whole world's just been flipped upside down. Though he converted, he didn't understand. He was not instantly Paul the Apostle. He didn't understand all of the nuance of grace and the law and all these things. He had some questions. And so he goes, after this happened, I didn't go consult with any of the other apostles. And he goes, I didn't consult with any man at all. Rather, I consulted with God. And he went to Arabia. So the clear inference there is when he says, I didn't consult with man, I consulted with God in Arabia, he's basically saying that I went to Mount Sinai. We can't conclude that conclusively, but this is the only two references to Arabia in the whole New Testament, is in Galatians 1 and Galatians 4. And he had just referenced saying, Mount Sinai is in Arabia. He made it very clear that Mount Sinai is in Arabia. So when Paul says, I went to consult God in Arabia, i.e. the home of Mount Sinai, it stands to reason that he probably followed the pattern of Moses and Elijah. And this is something that's believed, by the way, by a pretty wide range of scholars and commentators. N.T. Wright, I love his writing. I'm not a huge fan of his replacement theology and his amillennialism, but he just actually wrote about this in his blog recently, talked about Paul's trip to Mount Sinai. He just assumes so, that this is the case, as I do as well. So here's what's amazing as you think about it. So here was Paul, this Pharisee of Pharisees, like Elijah. He went to seek the face of God there in Mount Sinai. By the way, there is a prominent cave on the eastern face of the mountain, just like we would expect to find if this is Mount Sinai. And we know this is most likely where Elijah would have gone and had his encounter with the Lord. And it may very well have been the place where Paul went as well. And that's fascinating to go there, to this place that's untouched. And so here's the thing, is Paul received, he says, I received my gospel from God while he was seeking the Lord. And so this is probably the place where the law was given, that the Lord revealed to Paul that you're not saved by the law, that you're saved by grace, that it's always been by grace. And the Lord taught Paul the things that he had actually always been teaching. It's just that it's easy to miss if you have more of a legalistic mentality, if you will. And that's not to say that, as most modern evangelicals just say, well, the law is done away with. Paul doesn't really teach that. Paul kind of has a very nuanced perspective on the law and understood the importance of these instructions that the Lord had given to his people. This was essentially the marriage vows. These were the marriage vows in this marriage covenant that the God of heaven and earth made with his people Israel. Okay, so first of all, there's this reference to Paul most likely visiting Mount Sinai, which he specifies as being in Arabia. Now, here's the controversy, is that the traditionalists will say, well, yeah, Paul said Mount Sinai is in Arabia. They go, however, in Paul's day, based on an analysis of the Greco-Roman geographers of this period, the Sinai Peninsula would have been considered Arabia as well. And so Paul was just referring to the Sinai Peninsula. The problem with this, and this is, I talk about this in my book, is that really you've got a range of meanings for Arabia in Paul's day. In Paul's day, Arabia most specifically would have referred to the Arabian Peninsula. That was always Arabia proper. But it was also used in a broader sense, sort of any place outside of Israel where Arabs lived. And you could say that of Syria, you could have said that of Iraq, you could have said that of the Sinai Peninsula. So it's a huge area. And sometimes it was even just sort of used as an idiom for the East. It actually refers to Jews from the East as Arabs. And so the question is, how was Paul using it? Was he just using it in a very broad sense, the way that maybe Greco-Roman geographers would use it, or was he using it in a very specific biblical sense? Well, when you look at Paul's argument, it's a very nuanced, very spiritual, very theological argument. He's talking about Hagar and Ishmael. He's talking about this juxtaposition between Mount Sinai and Zion and all of these things. And where did Hagar and Ishmael's sons all settle? Well, they settled in Arabia. They settled in northwest, modern-day Saudi Arabia. So I use this analogy. I go, look, let's just say in 2,000 years from now, or even just 300 years from now, someone is looking at a manuscript from our age, our time, and it says, "Make America Great Again." Or let's just say it says, "God bless America." And some scholar says, well, you need to understand that, in the 21st century, America included Canada, it included Costa Rica and El Salvador. And in all likelihood, that's what this phrase is referring to. And it says, "Make America Great Again." It was clearly referring to Central America. Well, technically, some of the statements that he's saying are true, but anybody who understands the context of our time knows that that's a silly statement. America is referring to the United States of America. Yes, technically, America includes North and South America, etc. Well, in the same way, unless it was qualified, unless Paul specified, there's no reason to believe that he was referring to the Sinai Peninsula or to Syria or to Iraq. He was referring to Arabia proper. He was referring to the land of Ishmael, the ancient homeland of the Arabs. And, scholars just sort of offhandedly assert and even mock anyone that says otherwise. They go, if you say that Paul wasn't referring to Sinai, that's completely ridiculous. And I go, no, based on the context of Paul's day, he was not likely referring to the Sinai Peninsula. He gives us no reason to believe that. In fact, everything within the text points to Saudi Arabia and not the Sinai Peninsula.
Well, just a couple more questions here as we begin to wrap up. Say, in God's providence, why is it important for Mount Sinai to come back on the world scene in a big way? Because for those that have been interested and read books from some of the people we mentioned, this topic, this site, it's been kind of hidden for quite a while. If some people were in the know, other people not. Why do you speculate God's going to highlight this in a big way in the coming years?
Well, some of it is just personal speculation and feeling, sort of what I'll say, discerning in my spirit. Some of it is just very real things that are unfolding in the earth right now. All of a sudden, out of the blue, we have Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. He's moderating the country. They're having open air, mixed gender concerts. Women are driving. They're letting women go to movie theaters. I mean, this is a dramatic change in the country. And one of the things that he wants to do is build this massive mega city state up there in the Tabuk province, the northwest province of Saudi Arabia. It's a city the size of the state of Israel. Okay, so this is a big area. Right in the middle of it is this particular mountain. And so part of his desire to diversify the economy is to build the city to welcome in all kinds of foreign investment, industry, and he's actually going to have it will have its own laws, distinct from the rest of Saudi Arabia. They want to bring in tourism. The point is, all of a sudden, out of the blue, the Saudis want to open this up to the world. In fact, they've actually reached out to me and asked, because my plan all along has been to make a very nice cinematic film They want us to make this film. So they're as excited about it as we are. And so that's just sort of something in the natural. The Lord has willed, the Lord is the one that ordains kings and princes. He's willed that this thing becomes brought out to the forefront for the world to see at this time. Now, why at this time? Well, I would say because we're living in a time. First of all, I believe that we're approaching the time of the return of Jesus. I don't know how soon, but I believe we are moving in that direction fast. I believe that culturally, we're going to hit a tipping point very soon. I know this is sort of a bold statement to make, but I don't believe Christianity is sustainable for another 100 years in light of global social trends and technology and this sort of thing. So I believe Jesus is coming back most likely in our lifetimes or, in the next generation or so. And I believe that we are living in an age of incredible unbelief, of atheism, of aggressive runaway unbelief. And I believe that when I look at the story of the Exodus, the story throughout the scriptures is emphasized. Remember the mighty things that I did when I led you out of Egypt. Remember how I saved you, how I sustained you with a mighty and outstretched hand. The Passover is all about so that you will remember, so that you will teach these things to your children. And by and large, we have forgotten. The world of Exodus scholarship, most of them don't even believe the Exodus happened. Much of the church has forgotten. Much of even the Jews today, they go, well, we don't really believe the Exodus is historical. I believe the Lord is about to remind the world, remember. Remember these things. Remember the mightiest, most powerful, most outrageous things that he did in the whole story. Coming down in fire, in smoke, with trumpets. The Israelites are at the base of the mountain begging him to stop. He ripped the ocean in half. You could have even followed Jesus around during his ministry and still walked away in unbelief. You could have seen the miracles and still walked away in unbelief. But those at the foot of the mountain, at Mount Sinai, they didn't wake up the next morning and say, was I hallucinating? You know what I mean? They were begging Moses, please tell him to stop talking. They knew that God was present. And so the Lord is about to remind everyone of the foundation of the whole story, because the God who came down in fire, in the cloud, with an earthquake, with trumpets on the mountain, is coming back in fire, in the clouds, with a mighty earthquake at the sounding of the trumpets. And he's coming back soon. And this is the essence of the gospel. God has appointed a man to judge the living and the dead. Repent, therefore, because the day of the Lord is at hand. And I believe that those of us that still take proclaiming the gospel seriously, I think we're about to get some divine assistance. Look, the Lord uses these things in the same way that he used the reestablishment of the state of Israel to fuel the Jesus movement, the most recent, most significant revival in American history. I think that he's actually going to use this mountain as well to testify, because this is what he has. He has a testimony. If we don't speak up, then the rocks themselves are going to cry out.
That'd be a great place to end the interview, but we have a couple of practical questions yet, so we're going to keep going. Talk to us about your teaching series related to the book. I mean, the book is fabulous, but you have a teaching series that's going to take people a little deeper. Tell us about that.
Basically, some people are visual learners, some people are readers. I just created a 9-class DVD or flash drive set that just goes along with the book. It's just me. As you can tell, I can talk. And so it's me just sitting in front of the camera, working through the material. So you get a lot of my extra ramblings and such, but it's basically the material in the book. We've got bundles to where you can get a discount or you can just get one or the other. And I'm shifting everything, by the way, to flash drive sets rather than DVDs. I know some people still do DVDs, but I think flash drives are much more convenient. So we're starting to shift everything in that direction.
And Joel, for people who want to find out more about this book, the teaching series, and all of your other resources, where's the best place for them to find you on the web?
So I'm at joelstrumpet.com, JOELS trumpet.com, or JOELS-trumpet. Either one is going to get you there, and you just click on the store, and we've got all my resources. And let me say this as well, Shaun. If you really want to read the book, but you don't have the ability to buy the book, you can also get it on Amazon. If you get it through my site, you get it signed. Just today, just before this interview, I have released all of my books, both old and new, for free on my website. If you click on free resources, you can just read the book as a PDF. You can download it, put it on your laptop. I'm basically giving everything I do away for free going forward. And so with that said, I want the information to get out there. if someone wants to become a regular supporter, of course, that would be a great blessing. I do need more regular supporters, but this is something I've just stepped out in faith and said, the information is more important than trying to protect it and so forth. So it's all available. It's all out there for free. But if you want the hard copy, again, you can get it either through the website or through Amazon.
Well, like we do with every episode, we'll have links in the show notes to places where you can connect with Joel online and pick up all of his different resources. So when you're done listening, head on over to ShaunTabatt.com. We'll have all that linked up for you right there. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Joel Richardson. Once again, our book today was Mount Sinai in Arabia, the True Location Revealed. Again, if you want to connect with Joel and find out more about his resources, a great place to start is his website. Once again, that's at joelstrumpet.com. And Joel, I just want to say thanks so much for sharing with us today. It's always a great pleasure and an honor to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, Shaun. I sure appreciate it.